Ambassador Kiravel stood in her private chambers aboard the diplomatic vessel, her crystalline skin flickering with nervous energy. The pale blue light emanating from her translucent form cast dancing shadows on the walls as she read the same document for the 100th time. Her 3 delicate fingers gripped the datapad so tightly that small cracks appeared along its edges. The assignment was simple on paper: travel to neutral space, meet with Earth's representative, negotiate the Epsilon Station mining rights that would determine the future of galactic commerce for the next century, sign a treaty that would benefit both species, return home as a hero. But nothing about this mission felt simple to Kiravel. Therefore, intelligence reports spread across her desk painted a terrifying picture of humanity. According to Nexari scouts, humans had spent thousands of years killing each other in brutal wars. Their planet's history read like a catalog of violence. Massive conflicts that claimed millions of lives, weapons that could destroy entire cities, and a species that seemed to thrive on competition and conquest. The reports described humans as apex predators who viewed diplomacy as just another form of warfare. And now she had to sit across a table from one of them. Her counterpart's file made everything worse. Jinwoo Park, former military commander turned diplomatic representative. The holographic image showed a tall figure with sharp features and dark eyes that seemed to look right through the camera. His service record listed numerous combat deployments across human space, followed by a transition to diplomatic work that had proven devastatingly effective. The Centauri trade negotiations, the Vegan boundary dispute, the Proxima resource accords. In each case, Jinwoo had represented human interests, with such skill and determination that opposing diplomats had reportedly left the negotiations in tears. Some had requested transfers to avoid facing him again. Others had simply retired from diplomatic service entirely. Kiravel's species, the Nexari, had evolved on a peaceful garden world where conflict meant disagreeing about which flowers to plant in the communal gardens. They communicated through harmonious light patterns and made decisions through patient consensus. Violence was so foreign to their nature that they didn't even have words for many human military concepts. Their first contact protocols assumed that all intelligent species would naturally prefer cooperation over confrontation. Meeting humanity had shattered that assumption. The reports described humans as physically imposing, emotionally unpredictable, and strategically ruthless. They apparently negotiated by making demands, applying pressure, and using something called leverage to force favorable outcomes. The very concept made Kiravel's crystalline form dim with anxiety. How could she possibly match such tactics when her people's idea of firm negotiation involved politely suggesting alternative viewpoints? She tried to calm herself by reviewing the Nexari meditation techniques her grandmother had taught her. Close your inner light. Feel the harmony of the universe. Remember that all beings seek connection and understanding, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jinwoo's photograph staring back at her with those intense human eyes. The worst part was the pressure from her own government. The Nexari coalition desperately needed access to the rare minerals found in the Epsilon Station asteroid field. Their technology depended on elements that were becoming increasingly scarce in their home system. Without a favorable treaty, their civilization would face slow decline as their equipment failed and couldn't be replaced. But the humans had arrived at Epsilon Station first, established mining operations, and claimed territorial rights under galactic law. They held all the cards and they knew it, and the Nexari could only hope that human greed might be tempered by human reason. Kiravel's communication device chimed with an incoming message from Coalition headquarters. Her supervisor's image appeared in miniature, surrounded by the soft, golden glow that indicated extreme concern. Ambassador, we've received additional intelligence about your human counterpart. Jinwoo Park reportedly ended the last 3 negotiations ahead of schedule by presenting ultimatums that his opponents couldn't refuse. Be prepared for aggressive tactics, and remember that the future of our people depends on your success. Their message ended, leaving Kiravel alone with her fears once again. She looked at herself in the polished metal surface of her desk, noting how her normally bright blue luminescence had faded to a sickly pale color. Even her own reflection looked frightened. Tomorrow, she would board the transport to neutral space. Tomorrow, she would face the human diplomat whose reputation had spread terror throughout the galaxy's peaceful species. Tomorrow, she would discover whether diplomacy could survive contact with humanity's allegedly brutal nature. Tonight, she could only tremble and hope that her species' faith in universal harmony wasn't about to be crushed by cold human logic. The diplomatic station's conference room felt enormous as Kiravel entered, her crystalline form casting fractured rainbows across the sterile walls. Her heart beat so rapidly that her inner light pulsed in nervous staccato rhythms. 3 Nexari guards flanked her, their own luminescence dim with shared anxiety. None of them had ever been this close to a human before. She had spent the entire journey rehearsing this moment. Walk in confidently. Maintain proper posture. Don't let the human see weakness. Remember that the future of her people depended on projecting strength, even if she felt anything but strong. The door on the opposite side opened, and Kiravel's prepared speech died in her throat. Jinwoo Park entered the room with measured steps, but something was completely wrong with the picture she had built in her mind. Instead of the intimidating predator from the intelligence reports, she saw a man moving with deliberate slowness, his hands visible and relaxed at his sides. He wore simple diplomatic robes rather than military dress, and his expression held none of the cold calculation she had expected. But what happened next shattered every assumption she had made about humans. Jinwoo stopped exactly 3 meters away from her position, the precise distance required by Nexari personal space customs. He placed his right palm over his heart and extended his left hand forward with fingers spread wide in the traditional Nexari greeting of peaceful intentions. Then, in a voice that carried none of the harsh tones she had been told to expect, he spoke. "Honored Ambassador Kiravel, I greet you in the light of understanding and the hope of mutual benefit. May our words today plant seeds of friendship that will grow strong between our peoples." The words came out in perfect Nexari, complete with the tonal variations that carried emotional meaning. His pronunciation was careful and respectful, like someone who had spent considerable time learning not just the language but the cultural weight behind each phrase. Kiravel stood frozen, her light patterns shifting through confused spectrums. This was supposed to be the monster who had crushed opposition across 3 star systems? The brutal negotiator who reduced opponents to tears? Her translator device, a small crystal mounted on her shoulder, suddenly sparked and went dark. The backup unit she wore on her wrist flickered once before dying completely. In the span of seconds, she had lost her ability to communicate in standard galactic, the common language of diplomatic meetings. Panic crept up her spine as she realized the implications. Without translation, she would have to conduct these critical negotiations in her native tongue, putting her at a severe disadvantage. Most alien diplomats knew only basic Nexari phrases, if any. She began to formulate an apology, preparing to request a postponement while replacement equipment could be found, but Jinwoo simply smiled and continued speaking in fluent Nexari. "I see your translation equipment has malfunctioned. Please don't be concerned. I've been studying your language for several months in preparation for our meeting. We can conduct our entire negotiation in Nexari if that would make you more comfortable." His voice carried genuine warmth, not the calculating tone of someone trying to gain advantage from her technical difficulties. Instead, he seemed genuinely concerned about her comfort and well-being. As they moved toward the conference table, Kiravel noticed how Jinwoo modified his movements around her. Humans were physically larger and more robust than Nexari, and she had been warned about their tendency toward aggressive gestures and rapid movements that could be threatening to smaller species. But Jinwoo moved like someone walking through a garden of delicate flowers, his steps measured and his gestures confined to a small space around his own body. When she stumbled slightly on the unfamiliar station flooring, his hand moved instinctively to steady her, then stopped halfway as he realized the gesture might be unwelcome. Instead, he simply asked if she was all right, his concern evident in both his voice and the worried expression on his face. The conference table had been set with refreshments appropriate for both species. Jinwoo had somehow arranged for genuine Nexari light nectar, a delicacy that was difficult to obtain outside their home system. When she mentioned her surprise at finding it, he explained that he had spent weeks researching Nexari dietary preferences and cultural significance of sharing food during negotiations. "I read that sharing light nectar represents trust and hope for positive outcomes," he said, pouring the glowing liquid into a crystal glass designed specifically for her physiology. "I thought it might help us start our discussions on the right foundation." As the first hour of their meeting progressed, Kiravel found herself increasingly confused. Every report had described Jinwoo as a ruthless negotiator who bulldozed through opposition with superior preparation and intimidation tactics. But the man sitting across from her seemed more like a careful scholar who happened to work in diplomacy. He asked thoughtful questions about Nexari culture and genuinely listened to her responses. When she explained complex political situations within the coalition, he took notes and asked for clarification on points he didn't understand. His preparation was indeed thorough, but it seemed motivated by respect rather than a desire to find weaknesses to exploit. The contradiction between reputation and reality left Kiravel's mind spinning with possibilities she had never considered. What if the intelligence reports had been wrong? What if humans weren't the monsters she had been taught to fear? 3 days into the negotiations, Kiravel began to understand why Jinwoo had such a fearsome reputation, but it wasn't for the reasons she had expected. She watched him work through the morning session, taking detailed notes as she explained the Nexari coalition's mineral needs. His questions were precise and well-informed, revealing a depth of preparation that went far beyond what most diplomats attempted. He had studied not just the basic facts about her people, but their history, their technology, their social structures, and even their philosophical beliefs about resource sharing. When she mentioned the declining mineral reserves in Nexari space, Jinwoo didn't just nod politely. He pulled out detailed charts showing exactly which elements were becoming scarce, how quickly the depletion was occurring, and which Nexari colonies would be affected first. He had clearly spent months researching their situation before ever setting foot in this conference room. "Your people face a critical shortage of trilithium crystals within the next 15 years, he said, his voice carrying genuine concern. "Without access to new sources, your communication networks will begin failing, starting with the outer colonies. That's not just an economic problem. That's a threat to the survival of your civilization." Kiravel's crystalline form brightened with surprise. Most alien diplomats barely understood the basics of Nexari technology, let alone the complex interdependencies that made their society function. But Jinwoo had grasped the full scope of their crisis with frightening accuracy. The days progressed. She realized that his negotiation style wasn't based on intimidation or manipulation. Instead, he presented such thoroughly researched arguments and such well-reasoned proposals that opposing diplomats simply couldn't find flaws in his logic. His ruthless reputation came from being so prepared that he could address every possible objection before it was even raised. But what struck her most was the genuine care he showed for his own people's welfare. When discussing human colonists on remote mining stations, his voice carried a warmth that reminded her of how Nexari elders spoke about their children. He fought hard for favorable terms, not because he enjoyed winning, but because real people were counting on him to secure their future. "These aren't just numbers on a contract," he explained during one late-night session. "Every mining quota we negotiate affects thousands of families across human space. Parents trying to provide for their children, engineers working in dangerous conditions far from home, communities that depend on stable resource flows to survive. I can't let them down by accepting a bad deal, no matter how much I might personally like the people on the other side of the table." The fourth day brought disaster in an unexpected form. The diplomatic station's atmospheric processors had been calibrated for the most common alien species, but the specific mixture of gases needed for Nexari physiology required constant adjustment. Something went wrong with the environmental controls during the afternoon session. Kiravel felt the change immediately. Her inner light began to flicker erratically as the atmospheric composition shifted away from what her crystalline biology required. The room started spinning, and she could feel her thought processes becoming sluggish as her body struggled to process the alien air mixture. She tried to continue the negotiations, not wanting to appear weak or cause delays in the critical talks. But within minutes, her vision began to blur, and she swayed dangerously in her chair. Jinwoo noticed immediately. Without hesitation, he stood up and called for an emergency medical team. When she tried to protest that the negotiations were too important to interrupt, he looked at her with an expression of genuine alarm. "The negotiations can wait," he said firmly. "Your health cannot." The medical team arrived within minutes, but Jinwoo had already moved to support her, helping her remain upright while they worked to stabilize her condition. As they prepared to transport her to the medical bay, she expected him to return to his delegation and continue with other business. Instead, he followed the medical team and took up a position beside her treatment bed. "I'm staying until we know you're all right," he said when she questioned his presence. "My people can handle the paperwork without me for a few hours." The medical treatment required several hours as doctors worked to flush the contaminated atmosphere from her system and restore her natural light patterns. Throughout the entire process, Jinwoo remained at her bedside, occasionally asking the medical staff questions about her condition, but mostly just sitting quietly, ready to help if needed. As the treatment progressed and her mind cleared, Kiravel found herself studying this human who had abandoned crucial negotiations to ensure her well-being. The action made no logical sense from a strategic standpoint. He could have gained significant advantage by pressing forward while she was incapacitated, or at minimum, he could have used her medical crisis as leverage in future talks. Instead, he had chosen to prioritize her safety over his own diplomatic objectives. During the long hours of recovery, they talked about things that had nothing to do with mining rights or treaties. Jinwoo told her about his childhood on a human colony world, where his grandmother had taught him that true strength meant taking care of those who couldn't take care of themselves. He spoke about his military service, explaining that he had joined not because he loved fighting, but because he wanted to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. "Humans aren't naturally violent," he said quietly. "We're naturally protective. Sometimes that protection requires violence. But the violence is never the point. The protection is the point." These conversations revealed concepts that both fascinated and frightened Kiravel. The idea that an entire species would willingly put themselves in danger to protect others seemed almost impossible to believe. Yet she was witnessing it firsthand in Jinwoo's actions. By the time she recovered enough to return to negotiations, everything had changed. She no longer saw a ruthless predator across the table. She saw someone whose strength came from caring deeply about others, whose reputation for success was built on thorough preparation and genuine concern for his people's welfare. The realization left her questioning everything her people had believed about humanity. The breakthrough in negotiations came on the 7th day, when Kiravel and Jinwoo finally found a framework that could benefit both species. They were discussing mining quotas and profit-sharing arrangements when the conference room's security alarms began shrieking. The attack came without warning. Armed figures in environmental suits burst through the main entrance, their weapons already charging. Behind them came more attackers through the emergency exits, creating a coordinated assault that caught everyone off guard. "Death to the human negotiator," one of the attackers shouted in accented standard Galactic. "No peace with the predator species." Kiravel recognized the voice with horror. These were Nexari extremists, members of the radical faction that opposed any cooperation with humanity. They believed that humans were too dangerous to trust and that any treaty would eventually lead to Nexari subjugation. The security team responded immediately, but the attackers had planned their assault carefully. Smoke filled the room as they deployed concealment devices, and the sound of energy weapons echoed off the walls. Through the chaos, Kiravel could see Jinwoo's human security detail moving to protect their diplomat, but they were outnumbered and caught in an awkward position. One of the attackers broke through the defensive line, his plasma rifle aimed directly at Jinwoo's position behind the conference table. The weapon's charging whine filled the air as the assassin prepared to fire. Time seemed to slow down for Kiravel. She saw the weapon pointing at the man who had spent months learning her language, who had abandoned negotiations to care for her when she was sick, who had shown her that humans were capable of incredible kindness. The same man who was now about to die because of her people's prejudice and fear. She didn't think. She just moved. Her crystalline form launched forward, placing herself between Jinwoo and the assassin just as the plasma bolt discharged. The superheated energy struck her in the chest, and she felt her inner light flicker as the blast disrupted her crystalline matrix. Pain beyond anything she had ever experienced shot through her body as she collapsed to the floor. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was Jinwoo's face, filled with shock and concern as he caught her falling form. She woke up 3 days later in the station's medical bay, her chest wrapped in specialized crystalline repair bandages. The first thing she noticed was Jinwoo sitting beside her bed, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were red with exhaustion, and his clothes were rumpled from sleeping in the chair. "You're awake," he said, relief flooding his voice. "The doctors weren't sure when you would regain consciousness. Your crystalline structure was severely damaged." "You're alive," she whispered, her voice weak but steady. "That's what matters." Jinwoo leaned forward, taking her hand gently in his. The gesture would have been scandalous by traditional Nexari standards, but somehow it felt perfectly natural. "Why did you do it?" he asked quietly. "You could have been killed. The plasma bolt was meant for me, not you." Kiravel tried to find words to explain her actions, but the truth was simpler than any diplomatic response. "Because I couldn't let them hurt you. Because you've shown me what humans really are, and I couldn't stand by and watch ignorance destroy something beautiful." The confession hung in the air between them, carrying weight beyond mere diplomatic cooperation. Jinwoo squeezed her hand gently, his thumb tracing over her crystalline fingers. "I have something to confess too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't learn your language just for these negotiations. I started studying Nexari culture months before I was assigned to this mission, because the first intelligence reports about your people fascinated me. A species that had achieved interstellar travel without ever developing weapons of war. A civilization built on cooperation and mutual support rather than competition and conflict. I wanted to understand how such a people could exist." He paused, seeming to gather courage for what came next. "And then I saw your photograph in the diplomatic files, and I knew I wanted to meet you personally, not just as a negotiator, but as someone who represented everything I admired about your species. Your kindness, your dedication to peace, your genuine care for others. I've been learning your language because I hoped we might become friends. I never expected to feel something deeper." The medical monitors around Kiravel's bed began chiming as her light patterns shifted to colors that hadn't been seen since they first met. The warm golden glow of deep affection mixed with the clear blue of trust and understanding. "The extremists on both sides want to keep our peoples apart," she said softly. "They believe that humans and Nexari are too different to coexist. But they're wrong, aren't they?" Jinwoo nodded, his own expression reflecting the same mixture of hope and determination that filled her voice. Over the following days, as Kiravel recovered from her injuries, they worked together to craft something far more ambitious than the mining rights treaty they had originally been assigned to negotiate. Their new agreement included provisions for cultural exchange programs, joint scientific research initiatives, and shared colony projects that would bring their species together rather than simply managing their separation. The document they created wasn't just a contract between governments. It was a blueprint for friendship between two very different peoples, written by representatives who had discovered that their differences made them stronger rather than weaker. When news of their engagement was announced alongside the treaty signing, it sent shockwaves through both diplomatic communities. But it also inspired hope among those who believed that the galaxy's future lay in cooperation rather than isolation. The extremists had tried to destroy the negotiations through violence. Instead, they had inadvertently created something beautiful, proof that love could bridge any gap between species. The Grand Assembly Hall on Diplomatic Station Harmony had never hosted a ceremony quite like this one. Representatives from dozens of species filled the massive chamber, their varied forms creating a tapestry of galactic diversity. but all eyes were focused on the raised platform where two figures stood ready to change the course of interstellar relations forever. Kiravel looked out over the crowd, her crystalline form radiating a steady, confident light that would have been unimaginable just weeks earlier. Gone was the trembling diplomat who had once feared even meeting a human representative. In her place stood someone who had discovered that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite. Beside her, Jinwoo held the completed treaty document, its pages containing agreements that went far beyond simple mining rights. The contract they had crafted together represented a new model for interspecies cooperation, one based on mutual respect and shared growth rather than cautious coexistence. Honored delegates, Kiravel began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. We gather today not just to witness the signing of a trade agreement, but to celebrate the birth of a new kind of partnership between our peoples. She gestured toward Jinwoo, who stepped forward with the treaty. As he began reading the key provisions, the audience listened with growing amazement. Cultural exchange programs that would send Nexari artists to human worlds and human scientists to Nexari research stations. Joint exploration missions to uncharted systems. Shared colonies where both species would work together to build new homes among the stars. But the biggest surprise came when Jinwoo finished reading and set down the document. Before we sign this historic agreement, he said, his voice carrying across the silent chamber, Ambassador Kiravel and I have an additional announcement that we hope will serve as a symbol of the friendship our peoples can achieve. Kiravel stepped forward, her inner light shifting to the warm golden patterns that indicated joy and celebration among her people. Jinwoo Park has asked me to become his life partner, she announced, her words creating a wave of astonished murmurs throughout the assembly. And I have accepted. Our engagement represents our personal commitment to the ideals contained in this treaty. The reaction was immediate and electric. Some delegates erupted in cheers, others sat in stunned silence, and a few began rapid conversations with their advisors about the implications of the first human-Nexari union in galactic history. The treaty, signing that followed, became more celebration than ceremony. Representatives who had arrived expecting a routine diplomatic event found themselves witnessing a moment that would be remembered for generations. When Kiravel and Jinwoo placed their signatures on the final page, the chamber erupted in applause that lasted for several minutes, but the real impact of their announcement became clear in the days and weeks that followed. News of their engagement spread throughout both human and Nexari space, carried by communication networks that had once been used primarily to spread warnings about the dangerous nature of interspecies contact. On human worlds, the story of the diplomat who had learned an alien language out of genuine interest and respect captured the public imagination. Jinwoo became a symbol of humanity's capacity for growth and understanding, proof that their species could form meaningful connections across the vast differences that separated civilizations. In Nexari space, Kiravel's transformation from frightened negotiator to confident ambassador inspired a generation of young diplomats. Her willingness to risk her life to protect a human colleague demonstrated that courage could take many forms, and that sometimes the greatest bravery involved opening one's heart to the unknown. 3 months after the treaty signing, Kiravel and Jinwoo stood on the surface of Kepler 442b, an ancient world that had been chosen for their honeymoon because of its significance to both species. The planet contained ruins left by a civilization that had vanished millions of years earlier, mysterious structures that had puzzled archaeologists from across the galaxy. "It's beautiful," Kiravel said, her crystalline form reflecting the light of the system's twin suns as they explored a temple complex that predated both human and Nexari civilizations. To think that someone once lived here, built these incredible structures and then disappeared into history. Jinwoo nodded, running his hand along the smooth stone walls that bore inscriptions in a language no living being could read. "It makes you wonder what they would think of us. Two species from different worlds finding love among the ruins of their lost civilization." They walked through the ancient corridors hand in hand, their different physiologies creating an interesting contrast but no longer seeming like an impossible barrier. Where once Kiravel had seen only differences that separated them, She now saw complementary strengths that made them stronger together. "Do you ever think about how this all started?" she asked as they paused in what appeared to be a ceremonial chamber, decorated with faded murals. "I was so terrified of meeting you that I could barely function. I was convinced you would be some kind of monster." Jinwoo smiled, the expression transforming his features in the way that had first made her realize how wrong her preconceptions had been. "I was nervous too," he admitted. "Not because I feared you, but because I wanted so badly to make a good impression. I'd studied your culture for months, but I was worried that all my preparation wouldn't be enough to bridge the gap between our species." As they continued their exploration of the ruins, they talked about the future they were building together, the joint colonies that were already being planned, the cultural exchange programs that would bring their peoples together, the children they hoped to have someday, though the medical challenges of interspecies reproduction remained significant. But mostly they marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. Kiravel reflected on how her greatest fear had become her deepest love, and how that transformation had opened possibilities she had never imagined. The ruins around them stood as monuments to a civilization that had once thrived and then faded into memory. But the love story being written by a nervous Nexari diplomat and a careful human negotiator promised to create something that would endure, a new chapter in galactic history where differences were celebrated rather than feared. Their honeymoon, among ancient stones, marked not an ending, but a beginning of an era where the galaxy's vast diversity would finally become its greatest strength.